Hello, welcome. My name is Robert Miller. I'm the research lead for Project WAfLS, Western Asio flammeus Landscape Survey. I'm here today to present our final results from the 2020 season and the comprehensive view over the last 6 years of studying this species. The presentation is titled Short-Eared Owl Population Size, Distribution, Habitat Use, and Modeled Response to a Changing Climate. Let's get started. So while I said I'm the research lead, this isn't my project alone. There are many other contributors to the program and co-authors on the results, and that includes all of our state coordinators from the core program and accessory programs such as the grouse and grazing program, and a lot of other program management that have participated in the guide creation and ongoing management of the program over time. So we thank them for their contribution as well. So short-eared owl conservation. Booms et al. Published a paper in 2014 entitled Assessing the Status and Conservation Priorities of Short-Eared Owls in North America. However, they put forth the argument that there has been a range-wide long-term population decline in short-eared owls in North America, that there's convincing evidence for this, but we lack resolution of that effect. We believe the decline is in the 60 to 80% range over the past 40 years, but it has not been able to be properly quantified. So they proposed a number of conservation priorities, many of which align with Project WAfLS, and Travis Boom specifically was instrumental in getting Project WAfLS started many years ago and helped with our coordination ever since. So the conservation priorities really to define and protect important habitats, improve monitoring, which is one of the key aspects of Project WAfLS, seasonal movements that we'll talk about, develop management plans and tools that we'll talk about, and one thing that we're not directly involved with but are feeding information into is the reevaluation of the NatureServe classifications for this species. So what are the Project WAfLS objectives? They've changed a little bit from 6 years ago, but have been steady over the last 3 or 4 years. And that is to identify the impacts of grazing practices on short-eared owls. We know that some papers have published that grazing is very incompatible with short-eared owls, where others have had mixed results. We want to quantify the population size of short-eared owls in all of our participating states, talk about and investigate how they fluctuate spatially and temporally, looking at habitat use and various influences on the owl's distribution, generate projections under various climate models. What might we expect from this species going forward? And then, most importantly of all, many tasks of which we're just getting started is implementing the high value conservation actions as a result of the data that we have collected over the last 6 years. So Project WAfLS works across the 8 western states. It started in Idaho with a pilot in Utah, expanded to all of Utah. Then we added Nevada and Wyoming. And then 3 years ago, we added Montana, Washington, Oregon, and California. So in some cases, I'll talk about the results over all 6 years. We did restructure the program between years 1 and 2. So sometimes I'm presenting consistent results over 5 years, and some aspects of the results are focused to the whole 8-state program. However, our 6 years in Idaho has helped inform the analysis in other states. So it all contributes together. I just want to acknowledge that over 90% of the effort in this program are done by community science volunteers. So many of you on the phone probably dedicated your time and vehicle mileage to help make this program a success. And I want to acknowledge your contribution and say thank you very much for that. There's no way we could do a program on this scale without all of you and all of the community science volunteers that have contributed. We think over 1,200 people have participated in this program over the 6-year period. So what does some of that look like? We Here I'm just highlighting the volunteer contribution. There were professional biologists who did some work on this program as well, that's summarized in the annual report, but this is just the volunteer contribution. We see that volunteers have contributed more than 22,000 hours to this program, and driven over 350,000 miles to gather the important data here. And those numbers are huge. They would be even larger if we tried to run this out of a central team versus using distributed volunteers to do surveys near their homes. So really, we're looking at $750,000 in volunteer contributions to make this program successful. So thank you very, very much to each and every one of you who participated. As we look at our survey grids here, I'm just using the last 5 years because that's when we've used a stable grid definition across the states. And we have 436 total grids. In 2020, because of COVID, we were able to survey fewer of those. Only 335 got surveyed. We found owls on 64 of them. But across the 6 years, 436 unique grids were surveyed with owls found at least once on those grids at 152 of them. So this was, while many of you may have gone out and surveyed and not found owls, 152 out of 436 is a pretty good result from what we were expecting when we started. So thank you. Now I want to go through the objectives one at a time and talk about the results as they line up with those objectives. So the first objective was to identify the impacts of grazing practices. And we did this a couple ways. For those of you who participated in the broader WAfLS surveys, you were asked to collect information about how much of the land around each point was grazed and whether any livestock were visible at the time. Those results came up kind of mixed overall. In 2 years, we had a negative association with grazing, the amount of landscape grazed and the presence of short-eared owl. 1 year, we had an intermediate effect, so maybe a little grazing was good, but as the grazing increased, the probability of short-eared owl presence dropped off. And then the other years, we just didn't have a significant effect. And I believe there's a real effect there. We just lack the resolution and specificity in the data that we gather to overcome the statistical hurdles. So one thing we did is we partnered with the Grouse and Grazing program led out of the University of Idaho. This is a manipulative program where they have controlled pastures that they're putting different grazing treatments on, working primarily on greater sage grouse, but they allowed us to join their program for 3 years, looking also at short-eared owls. And they have short-eared owls on most of their study sites. There's 5 study sites across southern Idaho, each split up into multiple pastures that receive different types of grazing treatments. And we found short-eared owls on all of the study sites and many of the pastures within there. So we're able to step back and look at, based on grazing treatment, did we find an association with short-eared owls and grazing treatment? And with the statistics in, we did not find a significant effect of grazing on short-eared owl presence. And at the pasture or study site scale or at the point scale. So basically this suggests that short-eared owls and grazing are not mutually exclusive, which is good news for our land use capabilities and management practices. However, we do still think there is a bit of effect there, and that becomes present in the next analysis where we look at the utilization. So the grouse and grazing team went out into across those pastures and looked at how much of the landscape is used by grazing animals around each of these points. And we determined that there is a strong negative association with the amount of utilization. So where the grazing animals are spending the majority of their time, short-eared owls appear to be strongly excluded from those areas. But they're staying on the same pastures in areas where the animals are not grazing. So overall, we need to think about grazing as a non-mutually exclusive activity, but one that may require some specific management around the utilization levels for grazing animals and short-eared owls to coexist. So that was a very important finding of our study on objective number 1. So let's go to objective number 2, where we're looking at the population size among the various states. And with this, we used a multi-scale occupancy model. It's a statistical procedure that allows us to look at the point scale and the grid scale, also look at habitat influences. And these just show some, we're using a principal components analysis here, which is another type of statistical procedure that allows us to deal with some of our habitat types being correlated with each other. But I've put the terms in here to kind of show what these compositions are representing. And the graph on the left is really showing us that we found short-eared owls much more often on natural landscapes, natural sagebrush lands and natural grasslands, versus those more anthropogenic landscapes such as row crops and orchards. Similarly, on the other side, we see that hay and pasture is also favored for presence, more so than the same row crops, but also marshland. And that was a little bit of a surprise. We've gotten it consistently out of the Project WAfLS results over the last 6 years that marshland, while this is a species that uses marshland, when we surveyed marshland, we did not find short-eared owls at any greater abundance. So we need to think about that in context of, are they really avoiding it, or are they harder to detect in those environments? But our results show that it's not the dominant site in the Western US. So what do the occupancy numbers look like, or breeding density look like across our 8 states? And a mean average here. And we see that it's highly variable, something we expect from short-eared owls. And it appears that the population center is moving from state to state. Now, we don't know if that's a numerical response, like the population is decreasing in Idaho as it's increasing in Montana, or if birds actually moved from Idaho to Montana. So is it a result of movement, or is it a result of death in one place and birth in another place? And we'll have some future research actions to look into that. But overall, with all this variance, we see that dotted black line over the past 3 years being reasonably stable to slightly increasing occupancy. So the 60 to 80% over the last 40 years numbers that we went into this program with do not appear to be continuing with that. If we look back at 2017, Idaho which is that brown squirrely line there, and a lot of the other states were lower than they were in the last 3 years. So does that mean that the population was lower then? And I'll give you a little clue into some eBird analysis we did. The eBird analysis in Montana correlated 99% with the Project WAfLS results. So if we put the eBird numbers onto this chart for 2016 and 2017, we see that while the population was low in Idaho, it was high in Montana. So these counter movements of occupancy in Idaho and Montana may give us a little more confidence in the fact that the population might be moving versus intrinsic birth and death rates. So while we're on eBird, I'll just show you some of the quick results from the other states on how well Project WAfLS and eBird correlated. And I should say for eBird, I took all of the eBird data, I restricted it down to our survey stratum areas, and then normalized it by how much effort, how many checklists were submitted. So if we look at the states where the correlation was pretty high, and it's not even only correlation in values in the direction of the correlation, but in the density as well. So California is lower on the scale, Montana is higher on the scale because they have a higher population. So Montana in the lower left correlated almost 100%. Wyoming in the lower right, 79%. That's a very, very good correlation. Idaho did very well in the upper right in correlating with eBird response minus maybe some COVID effects in 2020. And then California in the upper left might have, minus COVID, might have performed better. We just really don't know. Maybe we'll know after another year. But not all states correlated as well. If we look at the other 4 states, they had negative associations or correlations or weak correlations that we'll be working on trying to understand these a little bit more. So eBird can be, we believe that eBird data is not as good as WAfLS. So eBird can be a proxy for the WAfLS densities, but not as strong as we would like in some of these states. So in conclusion for objective 2, we did see the habitat. They favor native landscapes to more anthropogenic landscapes, and that the rates are highly variable among states, but the overall, that dotted black line seems reasonably stable. It's definitely not sharply declining to the right. So we think that's very good news. So shifting on to objective number 3, how these populations fluctuate spatially and temporally. And this analysis is called a colonization extinction analysis. Colonization is you have a survey location where you don't find the birds in one year and you do the next year. That survey site is considered to be colonized. And on the opposite of that, if you have a site occupied that is not occupied in the subsequent year, that site has gone locally extinct. So when I'm using colonization extinction, it's on the site level, not overall. And so the colonization rate is on the percent of unoccupied sites that become occupied in the next year, and the extinction rate are the percent of extinct sites that are occupied sites that are not occupied in the subsequent year. I know that's confusing. Hopefully that made sense. So let's look at the grand table of numbers, and a lot of numbers here. I don't want, you can focus on these later. They're all in the annual report, which I encourage you to take a look at. We go through the explanation in more detail, but I want to highlight a few examples of how we as managers look at this data. So let's look at Utah. We see the occupancy. This is really kind of the lines off the chart that I presented previously. For Utah is reasonably stable, 17%, 15%, 11, 17, 23. So it went down a little bit, up a little bit. And we see the extinction rates reasonably low and the colonization rates reasonably low. Those are what we would expect of a reasonably stable population, maybe one that has higher site fidelity than elsewhere. If we look at Idaho, on the contrary, we see wide swings in occupancy, 35% down to 11%, back up to 27%. And we see corresponding very high extinction rates, 67% extinction, 90% extinction, 80% extinction. Luckily, we've been able to recruit birds to colonize and keep our occupancy rates reasonably stable. But we can conclude from this that the population in Idaho is less stable or has lower site fidelity potentially than the sites in Utah. And that's how we use this. So we can look at the habitat aspects that influence that. So population fluctuations, we show that this is colonization now. Birds are more likely to colonize, come in for the first time as breeders into sagebrush and grasslands versus those anthropogenic landscapes. So the sagebrush and grasslands are where they're most attracted to. If we look at the extinction modeling, we get that same component, kind of the inverse of it, in that sites are more likely to go extinct in the anthropogenic landscapes. So from that, we can conclude that the most stable landscapes across the 8 states are the sagebrush and grasslands. The native landscapes are the most stable, and the anthropogenic landscapes are less stable. Looking over in the lower right, we see grasslands, hay pasture, and marshlands had lower extinction than row crops and sagebrush. And now sagebrush has appeared on both sides of this equation. I kind of interpret that as it's kind of intermediate. So grasslands consistently on the left for least extinction, and row crops consistently on the right for highest extinction, and sagebrush is kind of in the middle. So we can look at that and look at the importance of prioritizing landscapes for conservation on the ones that are going to contribute the most stability to the population overall. So in conclusion, the densities shift largely, but the overall density is stable. We don't know for sure if these shifts are the result of movement or birth and death rates. And we do detect owls on anthropogenic landscapes on fairly high numbers, especially like, for example, in Idaho, a lot of those unstable sites were anthropogenic landscapes. But the populations in native shrubland and grasslands are the most stable with the highest continuous occupancy. So great results there. Let's move on to objective number 4, identify the distribution, habitat use, grazing, and climate influences on short-eared owls. We did a little bit of this back in the multi-scale occupancy. Here we did a new statistical procedure called boosted regression trees. It's a little more sensitive and gives us a little deeper information than the occupancy models that we reported on in objective 2. So here, the numbers bounce around a lot more. This is a machine learning technique, so it's much more modern technique. So you can't read too much into each little tweak, but you can see the general trend. Once again, and these are in the orders of the most important attributes at chart number 1, upper left, and there will be 7 of these down to the least important attributes. So composition number 1, the most important attributes are those native landscapes versus anthropogenic landscapes. And it's more positive on the native landscapes. So that's our number 1 theme, is conserve those native landscapes for this species. Number 3, composition number 3 in the upper right, sagebrush and the more grass-like fallow hay pasture environments over row crops and even marshes. And as I mentioned, that one's still a little bit of a surprise for us. We have some geographic features in here like ruggedness. So they like less rugged landscapes, flat lowland landscapes essentially. Lower right chart here is our first climate variable, where they're really kind of looking at an intermediate temperature in the middle of summer. So the warmest quarter is going to be the summer quarter, and they don't want it too cold or too hot. Intermediate effect there. Composition number 4 is looking at a little bit more towards sagebrush versus the grass marsh development. This one is the more confusing result. It came out in the opposite direction of the occupancy study that we did in objective number 2. So that warrants some further exploration. Moving over to the right, they are avoiding the driest environments where it's dry in the driest quarter. So they favor areas where precipitation at least occurs on a year-round basis. And then the last chart down here is intermediate or lower elevation. So they like lower elevations, maybe intermediate around 3,000 feet or so, and then dropped off. That's probably where most of our sweet spot habitat in Idaho, Utah, and Montana, Wyoming is falling in that range. So this is a lot of data, and I don't expect you to take it all away, but we'll be putting these into prediction maps in the next step here. and that's what can really drive the visualization of what all these effects look like. So conclusions on objective 4, natural versus anthropogenic landscapes are top, intermediate climate where the intermediate temperature and at least some precipitation, less rugged, lower elevation. So what are those projects if we take all of those values and climate models broader and integrate them in, where do we expect to find short-eared owls today and in 50 years? And for this is a very conservative climate projection in that it assumes no change in land use over the next 50 years, which we know is false. There's going to be urban development, population growth. There's going to be transformation via wildfire, range fire, etc. But it's a very conservative model. It also assumes that we make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions on far above what our trend is at the current time from a worldwide basis. So what's it look like? The picture on the left is the viability of short-eared owls today. So this is all those climate variables and habitat variables that I've just been talking about in the previous objective, put together and projected out to where we would expect short-eared owls to live. The green is more likely and the gray is less likely. Now these are models. They have some anomalies, like they aren't taking into account population growth. So all those short-eared owls right near Seattle is a model anomaly that we expect in models. But if you look at the broad, non-developed landscape, this is where most of the short-eared owls occur. And then shifting over to the right, that's a projection going out into 50 years from now, so 2070. Under a climate model assumes that we make quite a bit of progress. And this is a bleak picture for California, Nevada, most of Utah, and even Idaho and Wyoming, and a significant reduction in Montana. So what does that look like? The future viability will decrease by 59% in the next 50 years. The amount of good habitat is expected to decrease by 76% in 50 years, and the amount of great habitat by 60%. So we have some work to do to conserve those best landscapes for this species. So I don't want to be alarmist, but that's what the numbers and models tell us from a very conservative projection. So this will be a area that we focus a lot on in the steps going forward. So objective 6, implement high value conservation actions. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're just getting going on these. Identifying conservation threats, talk a lot about that in the annual report and in previous years' presentations, roadway mortality, stock tank drowning, agricultural harvest practices, rodenticides, etc. We've quantified some of those effects. Outreach and education, just the participation of 1,200 people is a huge outreach initiative, but we continue our emphasis to get the word out at scientific conferences, scientific publications, into local chapters of Audubon societies and naturalist societies, but also newspaper articles, public radio interviews, etc. So a lot of activity in that regard. Probably our most direct effect on conservation will be through integrating with the state wildlife action plans. We've already done some integration with Idaho, who updated their plan in 2015. So we had 1 year of data to go in there. But most of the states will be updating their state wildlife action plans between years 2022 and 2025. And we're set up and already integrating the results into their planning for the prioritization of state and federal money within each of these states for conservation. And then building a network of conservation individuals and organizations. We've recruited a partner advisory board and had a few focus groups so far on what are the tools, what are the mechanisms, what information do they need in what format to directly influence these conservation actions. So a lot of activity in a lot of broad areas. We highlight some of those in the annual report. to a greater degree. So I encourage you to check that out. So future research, we are discontinuing the 8-state survey portion of WAfLS. With our 3 to 6 years of data, we think we've answered the big questions and gotten the bang for the buck. It would be beneficial to have more years overall, but we think that those investments on a 8-state scale would better be spent on actually implementing some of these conservation actions. Now, some of the states will continue with state programs. I know California is one of those that is ramping up for a 2021 program to deliver data and try to smooth out a little bit of the COVID effects from 2020. So we encourage you to continue to participate in the California program, and should any other state programs move on. I talked about eBird. We'll continue our monitoring of the population overall through eBird. We do have a pilot program in Idaho looking at mortality mitigation in agricultural landscapes. We know a number of these short-eared owl nests are destroyed in agricultural harvest, primarily in alfalfa. Well, the evidence we have is it definitely occurs in alfalfa, maybe elsewhere. And so we do have a research project looking at more effective ways to discover the nests and protect the nests from those harvest procedures. We have a movement program. We have some historical data from Travis Booms in Alaska and Matt Larson with the Owl Research Institute in Montana. In partnership with the Teton Raptor Center, we put out a couple more transmitters in Wyoming this past season, and we have 13 more transmitters to put out across the other 6 states this year to really try to get at this question of how these animals move state to state, and if they move state to state, site fidelity, etc. So look forward to hearing more about that. And ultimately, with all of these conservation issues, we need to answer the question of whether the source of mortality is additive or compensatory. We hate to see any mortality, but it's even more important if it's having a population level effect. That would be additive mortality. We know that 3/4 of all young raptors die in their first year. So if a source of mortality is just contributing to that 3/4 number, it's not having a population level effect. We call that compensatory. But we believe that a number of these conservation actions are having an additive effect. But we ultimately need to quantify that to drive those direct conservation actions, especially when those conservation actions are very expensive, like roadway mortality. So that's the end of the presentation. I want to acknowledge the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for funding kind of the core management of this program and the time of the coordinators in each of the 8 states that made all of this possible. Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for managing that grant. The Pacific Flyway Council Non-Game Technical Committee endorsed this program, helped us get that funding, helped us prioritize this within each of the state organizations, so played a critical role there. The state coordinators, there is no way you can run that. We could run an 8-state program from Idaho, for example. So I am deeply indebted to all of the state coordinators who have participated for 1 year, 2 years, or more years in the program. So thank you very much. The organizations that have supported them, but most importantly, are the more than 1,200 volunteers who have invested that $750,000 over the last 6 years to make this program successful. I'm at awed every time I look at that number, and just can't believe everyone's generosity. So thank you very much. Let's continue to work together to help conserve this species. So with that, I bring this presentation to an end. I encourage you all to read and take a look at the annual report posted on our website. And if you have questions, you can contact your state coordinator if you're a participant, or you can contact me directly. My email is Robert Miller and the digit 7 at boisestate.edu. Thank you once again for your time in viewing this presentation and your contributions to the program over the years. Take care.